Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. When our crew was preparing the set for today's program, I was half tempted to have my guests separated. I was going to sit between them as a referee because, you see, they happen to be combatants, enemies in America's bloodiest war, the Civil War. But in actual fact, they're just pretending to be figures from the Civil War with connections to Paducah, and they're really very good friends. You will see them and others in full regalia on October the 30th for a combination of history and Halloween at the Tillman home. Let me introduce our guests. First, we have General Ulysses S. Grant, John Suttles. Welcome, General.
Thank you.
We have Bill Baxter, who will appear as Colonel Stephen G. Hicks. He's now in civilian attire. He's the director of the Tillman home. And last, we have John Weaver, who is portraying General Lloyd Tillman. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Barry.
Now, before I begin, I would like to make an editorial plug for your museum. It's a very, very nice museum, small, private, nonprofit museum, one of the best I've been in around the country. And I also want to thank John for allowing me to drive his World War II Jeep many years ago. And speaking of many years ago, I interviewed John many years ago when John his hair wasn't gray, but he's still thin. My hair is gray, and well, you can see me from there. Let's begin with the director and tell us about the program. First, tell us about the Tillman home, maybe a little bit of the history about it, and we'll let the general talk about his own home as well. But tell us about the museum and then this program as well.
Well, the museum has been in operation, as many people in Paducah know, since 1998 when it did open as a museum. It's set up to portray Paducah and Western Kentucky's roles during that very critical period in our country's history. And we think that with all the wonderful stories and history that this area has to offer, that we have some great programs. And we would encourage anyone to come out and learn about the vast history that does exist.
Well, let's talk about this program specifically, October the 30th. Just give us a rundown of what we can expect.
Well, you can expect to come into the home and meet the key players that surround the Lloyd Tillman House and Civil War Museum. You'll be invited into the home by Mrs. Lloyd Tillman, Augusta Tillman.
And who will play her?
That will be John's wife.
Well, that'll be handy.
And she'll pass you off to these two individuals, General Tillman and General Grant, to kind of lay out the beginnings of the war here in Paducah. And then we'll move into the other areas of the home, and you'll meet such distinguished individuals as Nathan Bedford Forrest and General Abe Buford.
And they'll be played by?
John?
Forrest is going to be played by a fellow by the name of Craig Kane. He'll look the part. Abraham Buford, who is my ancestor, by the way, will be played by Randy Beeler. And then, of course, there's Bill that will play Stephen Hicks, and we have another fellow, Stephen Harned, who's going to play Albert Thompson.
Wow. And the time for this, we need to talk about the time.
The time is going to be set up between the hours of 5 and 9 p.m. on the evening of 30 October.
So it'll be all indoors?
It'll be all indoors, and the tickets are being sold in blocks. There will be 5 hourly periods because of the...
So they're time tickets?
They're time tickets due to the size constraints of the building.
Right. Have you all done this before?
No, this will be our first time that
And
we've
hopefully
done
first
this.
annual.
Yes, hopefully so.
Yeah, that's great.
And also there'll be a Confederate camp set up outside, and also we'll have a couple playing period music on period instruments and stuff.
Who will be the musician? Let's give everyone credit. We can name
They're from the east end of the state, Tommy Rector and his wife.
And they will be playing?
Yes, sir.
What instrument?
She'll play a flute, and then he'll play, I believe, a guitar.
They have
and
guitars,
stuff.
banjos,
Stringed
a
instruments.
lot of stringed instruments.
Yes, sir.
Very good, very good. Well, the house itself, I live in Mayfield, but I've been working in Paducah since 1976, and I've passed that house I don't know how many times. how did the house was basically, wasn't it a dance studio at one time? It had many different uses before
It did
you
over
all
the years.
restored it.
The house was pretty much a single-family dwelling from the time that the Tillmans occupied it first in 1852.
Were they the first residents in
They
the
were
house?
the first residents of the home. And then, as I said, it was retained its single-family status right up until the turn of the century, 1900. Then it became a boarding house and an apartment building. Along came that devastation of 1937, the big
Right,
flood.
right.
The fact that the old girl survived the flood was a miracle in itself. Right. After that, the building was turned into an office type environment for various and sundry businesses. Mm-hmm. There have been lawyers in there. There've been certified public accountants. At one time, there was a hairdresser shop on the upper floor. But as you said, in the lower floor, it was turned into a dance studio one time, and I still have people coming into the museum who remember as young children being dropped off on Kentucky Avenue to go in and learn how to dance.
Yeah. Well, now, how much of the building is original and how much was added on later?
Well, we've only recently learned that much more of the building was original than what we had been initially led to believe. So there have been some changes and some additions over the years, but pretty much what you see at the home was there since the first structure in 1852 when it was built by Mr. Robert Woolfolk.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it one of the few pre-Civil War buildings left in Paducah?
It's one of the three, what they say, federal-style buildings that are still in existence. All three happen to be current museums. Mm-hmm. Or we have Whitehaven out on I-24, the Visitor Center, mm-hmm. and then we have the River Discovery
mm-hmm.
Museum, and then ours, of course. And those mm-hmm. are the three federal-style buildings that, mm-hmm. that have been in existence since before the war.
Well, let's turn to General Tillman and ask, you are a native of Maryland, I believe.
Absolutely
and
right.
went to West Point.
That's
and
right.
were a military engineer.
That's
what
correct.
brought you to the River City?
Interesting. After graduating from West Point, as a lot of young men did in those days, that went into civil engineering. And for me, what that meant was building railroads. Mm-hmm. And so
now, at the time, is it true today that West Point graduates are engineers? Used to be, was it traditional they were mechanical engineers when they graduated, or can they major in things
mostly
now?
in 1860s, when they graduated there, the emphasis was very strongly on engineering, mm-hmm. but they also had very important classes in drawing, in languages, mm-hmm. But the focus was on engineering, mm-hmm. pretty much.
So you became a railroad builder.
Built railroads, exactly right. Built railroads all across the South. Then the war with Mexico occurred. Went into the military again, served there. When that war was over, came back to the South to build railroads.
Didn't you also build a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama?
I was one of the chief superintendents that did the construction of the railroad across the Isthmus of Panama before there was a canal.
I was going to say, maybe we might want to consider building a canal later. I mean, that's just a possibility. But the Army engineers could do that. Maybe have
Absolutely.
a president named Teddy Roosevelt. That's just a speculation. So you came here building what line?
Well, first of all, the city fathers in Paducah. Of course, Paducah always being a river city, mm-hmm. but they needed to get somebody to get their commerce into the interior, away from the rivers. And of course, this technology, which was really just coming into its own, was the railroad. And so they wanted someone to come. They contacted me. I came down. They were going to have the house as an incentive for my family and I to come. And so then they put out a canvas. They got funds together, and it was the New Orleans and Ohio Railroad that would run from the Ohio Railroad with the intent was to go all the way to New Orleans. As far as we got until 1861 was the railroad. That part of it actually ran from Paducah to Troy, Tennessee, where it connected with other railroads.
Now that line today would be the well, the P&L line from Paducah down to Mayfield, and then from Mayfield, where did it go?
From Mayfield, it went, like I said, down to Troy, Tennessee.
Would it have gone through Fulton?
No, it did not. It did not. That only came about later.
But the line, the reason I was asking, the road bed from Paducah to Mayfield as it exists now, is that the original road bed?
It's very close. Of course, they've changed some things where there's creeks and
Right.
low land,
But
but
roughly,
it's roughly the
that's
same.
the same line.
Roughly the same.
I always found that interesting if that would have been the original, the line. So you then take command of the Southwest Battalion of the Kentucky State Guard,
That's correct.
which isn't it true that before the Civil War that the Kentucky State Guard was one of the best state militia units in the United States?
Actually, that's true. Of course, you have to understand that Kentucky in that time period was the fourth richest state in the Union. And so with the presidential election, with the Declaration of Neutrality that Kentucky did, and the beefing up, building up of the Kentucky State Guard then to enforce that neutrality.
But you know, I had read that before the Civil War, a lot of these state militia units were basically social organizations.
Not so.
That's what I'm saying. Kentucky was different. That a lot of them, these fellows, you could put on a uniform and show off for the ladies and all that. But that the Kentucky State Guard was a very well-equipped military organization.
Yes.
Now the Southwest Battalion, you had companies scattered throughout the purchase.
Absolutely right. Companies and there were actually two companies in McCracken County. There was one in Graves County, at Ballard County, across all the counties that were in the purchase area, and also some east of the Livingston, Trigg. There were companies there. Not only did we have the troops, but we also had artillery.
Yes, there's a famous incident of the cannons being stolen and all that that good stuff. Yeah,
That's right.
Were those guns? Was that the original Cobb's battery? Those guns? I've always wondered about that.
Actually, no, because most of the guns that they had were 6-pounders.
Ah,
And as you may guess, 6-pounders were not all that effective.
right.
So
So do we know what became of those stolen guns?
I don't think so.
Probably not. No.
I don't think they disappeared.
Right.
But more than likely, they could have been melted down
Recast.
and recast as
Right.
12-pounder Napoleons.
Right.
More than likely.
Right. So the Kentucky State Guard, very strongly pro-Southern, the Kentucky Home Guard, Union.
Yes.
So in the summer of 1861, you take the nucleus of your outfit and you head where?
We get on the railroad.
You get on your rail. That was handy, very convenient. Yeah.
And we end up at Camp Boone, which is just across the state line in Tennessee, north of Clarksville.
Maybe there's a state historical marker on that highway that shows where Camp Boone was.
Yes, it
Is
is.
it US 79 or something?
Yes, it is 79, Highway 79.
Okay.
It sure is. And so all the Kentucky regiments, or most of the Kentucky regiments, not all, were organized there. And actually, the first one to be organized was the 3rd Kentucky. Later, the 2nd Kentucky, the 4th Kentucky were organized, but the first one was 3rd Kentucky, Company D. There were 10 companies per regiment. Company D was known as the Paducah Company. And so we organized, we were formed into units that were capable of combat and were trained very well.
And you were elected the first colonel?
First colonel of the 3rd Kentucky Confederate Infantry, Albert Thompson, was the lieutenant colonel, and Ben Anderson was the major.
Now, was it Thompson, was he an attorney here in Paducah?
That's right. Thompson was the attorney. Some records show that he was the Commonwealth attorney. Others show that he was just an attorney here.
Or an attorney, yeah.
But he was, and he lived in the city and was, as time passed and the Battle of Paducah was going to occur, he would end up dying about 2 blocks from his own doorstep.
Yeah. Now, so how were you elevated to general?
Well,
Pretty quickly,
well,
wasn't
of
it?
course, I had a West Point education.
Right.
And so there was an opening. Albert Sidney Thompson, the commanding general for the area, wanted to bring somebody into the general rank, brigadier general rank, to be responsible for the Fort Henry, Fort Donaldson, Hopkinsville area. They were looking for someone. Some people in the War Department said, "You've got somebody right there that's qualified. This is the person we think you ought to promote," and that happened to be me.
Now, I have read that when you arrived at Fort Henry, you were appalled at where this fort was built.
Complained bitterly because they had built Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, just over the Kentucky state line, below the high water mark in the
Right.
winter high water.
Right.
It was built below, so when the high water came on the Tennessee River in the winter, it was going to flood the fort.
So by the time Grant showed up and the gunboat showed up, if in a matter of days you'd have been flooded out anyway.
When the attack was made by Commodore Foote, water was already waist deep in the fort. It was waist deep. I tried to mollify that some by building Fort Hyman across the river in Kentucky on a
Right.
200-foot bluff, but it was too little too late.
Right. So when the gunboats arrived, you ordered the bulk of your men
Ordered all the
retreat
infantry over to Fort
to Fort
Donelson on the
Donelson,
Cumberland.
which is what, 12 or so miles away?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Then you were captured
that's right.
and were exchanged as a prisoner of war in what?
Well, actually, first
Ah.
I was sent off. I was sent off to Boston Harbor, Fort Warren, where I was kept in solitary confinement, along with Buckner when he surrendered.
Right.
We were both kept in solitary
And
confinement.
Buckner would have been your commander in the State Guard, Simon
That's
Bolivar Buckner.
Adjutant and Inspector General.
Yes, yes. You know, I read an interesting piece about him. His son was killed on Okinawa,
That's right, highest ranking general.
killed in combat in World War II. That's exactly right. But of course, that's in the future. How do we know that? It was a flight of fancy there, I guess.
Prescience.
It was excellent. Well put. Well put. So you were ultimately then exchanged
For John Reynolds,
for John Reynolds.
who will end up being the First Corps commander in the Army of Potomac and will be killed on the first day
At
at
Gettysburg, absolutely.
That's right.
Wow, that's an interesting turn of events.
Yes.
So you're back in action, and of course, then your life ends at Champions Hill.
Exchanged for Reynolds, I end up in Mississippi. The war has moved on south. This fellow over here's campaign is moving south.
We'll get to him in a minute, yeah.
We're resisting him. The Vicksburg campaign is on. They're trying to figure out how to take Vicksburg. He manages to get below Vicksburg and come across at Grand
Very
Gulf.
clever fellow. Yeah.
Yes. And when that happens, the largest battle in the Vicksburg campaign is Champions Hill or Baker's Creek.
Right.
And the Army had gotten cut off, and so the division that I was in, my brigade was the rear guard for the division getting out of there. And during that rear guard action, as I was directing some artillery to getting it aimed, I was struck by a projectile from the Chicago Board of Trade artillery battery.
Famous battery.
That's
It
right.
Sure was.
And struck and died in my oldest son's arms, Lloyd Tillman Jr.
Wow. And there's actually a statue of you at the National Park there at Vicksburg, and you wound up being buried in New York City in Woodlawn Cemetery.
Woodlawn Cemetery in
And,
the Bronx.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the first time I made my first pilgrimage to Yankee Stadium, I'm a big Yankee fan, we took the train on out past the stadium to Woodlawn, and I found your grave there.
Yeah.
Among a lot of famous New Yorkers, and that's a very famous cemetery. And then, of course, you're buried on Riverside Drive, down the other way. So you had relatives in New York. Is that how you wound up being
Well,
there?
my family, see, my wife was from Maine,
Right.
and so she had contacts up there. They had relocated to New York. That was one of the places where a lot of the Southerners that had the means to go there then after the war, they did. That went to New York. My wife did, and lived there until her death.
Now, you would have been buried on the battlefield originally,
Yes, it was. I was buried in Mississippi.
and then
Dysentered
moved
and taken to New
Woodlawn,
York
to
after the
Woodlawn.
war by two of my sons, Frederick and Seidel.
Wow. Well, General, you came to Paducah in September of 1861 and read an occupation proclamation. And I must quote one of your soldiers. He wrote a letter. He wrote home and he said, "I fell in love with Paducah at first sight. It's the most beautiful place I've ever been." He said, "I'm going to settle here after the war." He said, "The women are especially beautiful, quote, all fat and smooth skinned." I wondered about that. So tell us a little bit about Grant when he came to Paducah in September of 1861.
Well, Barry, we recognize right off the importance of Cairo at the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio, and also
Absolutely.
recognized the value of Paducah at the mouth of the Tennessee, and knew that would be the best waterway route into the South. And when I arrived in Paducah, Confederate flags were very much in evidence.
They were.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, you mentioned that in your memoirs,
Yes.
which, by the way, are excellent memoirs. But you had a fellow named Mark Twain helping you, I think, in that too. Yeah. He could turn a phrase.
It doesn't hurt to have
It
help,
does
you
not
know.
at all. You've got to have good editing. So,
But like I say, Confederate flags was very much in evidence. But after we arrived, we had 9th and 12th Illinois Infantry Regiments and Battery Artillery, and we landed at Paducah. But we were worried because General Polk had 10,000 troops at Columbus, and but the Confederate flags came down. And
but now
I
you
read the
guys also
proclamation.
built the pontoon bridge over to Illinois just in case. didn't you?
And that was just in case we had to get out of Paducah.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
I
That's right.
understand. Yeah. Another thing, there was a wonderful account. Of course, you had reporters with you. A St. Louis reporter noted in his story, he said that General Grant read an occupation proclamation saying, "I have come to protect you from the Confederate enemy," and then he put, "but the people didn't seem to appreciate the favor."
They were definitely pro-Confederate in
That was
Paducah.
well put. So you come to Paducah, and then you immediately shot some fellows up to Smithland too, didn't you?
Yes, sir. We took Smithland, and like I say, that opened up for the Cumberland, you know, to move down through there. And like I say, Paducah would become a major route for our troops and
Absolutely.
supplies and everything.
Absolutely. Now we are running out of time, so if I may, let me talk to Colonel Hicks and talk about the Battle of Paducah in March of 1864. This man is long gone in the South, and he's no longer with us. So one thing about that fort is it's depicted on the flood wall, and it makes it look huge. The walls look to be 20 or 30 feet tall. Describe what that fort really looked like.
Well, it's actually a Mahan design structure. Colonel Mahan was the superintendent at the Academy at West Point at the time, and so it was actually the design of the fort descends from Romans and through French designs, and incorporated into Mahan structure.
Yeah.
But it was an earthen structure, and as you noted, the wall mural painting makes it look much larger than life than it than.
So
than
how
actually
tall
was.
would the walls have been, approximately?
Probably not much larger than 20 to 30 feet.
So
and-
they would have
and-
had firing steps where you would shot, and of course notches for cannons.
That
there.
is
And it was
correct.
built around an old hospital, wasn't it?
That is correct. But the main point is that it was dug from the earth, and so there was no above ground stature to it, other than the large abatis or large moat type area around it. If you got any kind of elevation from around the fort, you would be in trouble, of which we found out. We, in my role as Stephen Hicks, the commander of the fort, found out during the battle. Many of the Confederate troops
Some of his
were
men, right.
able to gain access to the upper elevations, the upper floors
And
of
began-
buildings surrounding, and could literally
Well,
fire down into the
didn't
fort.
you later on burn the houses to clear out and give you a field of fire?
That is one of our lesser shining moments in the history of Paducah. But it was my conjecture that if General Forrest and the Confederates would return for a second day of battle, that they would do nothing other than gain access to those upper floors again. And it was my obligation as commander to protect my troops as best I could. And
But-
so I ordered.
Had you decided to run for mayor of Paducah, you probably wouldn't have gotten elected.
It may not have been.
But military necessity being what it was. So. And again, we're really running out of time. But Forrest came in, and his base of operations was the Catterjohn building. That there wasn't
Very
it?
close to it.
Where that grove of trees.
He established his field
there.
headquarters.
So he sends part of his men to the waterfront to take supplies. The rest he runs around to pin down the fort. And the controversy is, did he actually order the charge, or did Thompson freelance this?
Well, that's an interesting story. My opinion, since I was not on the scene at
Yes,
the
you
time,
weren't. You were, yeah.
But my
indisposed.
opinion is this was 1864. These were all veteran troops. They knew pretty much what they could do and what they couldn't do. Now, A.P. Thompson may have wanted to look really good for his hometown,
I've heard that theory.
but a close reading of the official records and the accounts from that, in my opinion, show that what really happened was there were about 3 lines of skirmishers that moved forward in the skirmish line, which is very different than a whole battle line moving
Right,
forward.
right.
And the skirmish line went forward toward the fort. And when they saw that there was a 16-foot deep ditch there, that there was abattis that they weren't going to be able to negotiate.
Now that, of course, that's trees. Abatis, the felled trees where they would fall them and interlace them
and sharpen the ends.
Yeah, yeah.
And so after those 3 skirmish lines went forward, then that's when they had started occupying the buildings, getting on the top floors,
Right.
and firing into
Right.
the fort.
We have 2 minutes left. Of course, the last part of this story, and it may be a legend. Thompson was killed in the Battle of Paducah. Was his head blown off?
He was just almost entirely torn apart. The projectile struck him. There are actually a couple accounts. One said men close to him were covered with his remains. Another said he was not. So it's probably somewhere in between. But it instantly killed him. He fell in the street. His horse ran about a block and a half.
Do you know
and died.
exactly where that was?
It was in an alleyway between 6th Street and 5th Street.
Right.
There's still a gravel alleyway there, and he was in that alleyway.
And the poor horse was also injured
Ran about a block and died.
and is supposedly buried in the curve around in the street there. Do you know that story?
Yeah.
Penny Balcom Fields, the Markin House, tells that story. And Thompson was taken to Murray, and I believe he's buried in a cemetery down there.
Yeah, he was buried first in Paducah, what his remains were. Actually, the mayor and another person helped gather up the remains and buried them, and then later he was disinterred and taken down to Murray where he's reinterred.
Well, we are almost out of time. Tell us one more time the dates, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and all that in 1 minute.
We're having our historic ghost talk on the 30th of October from 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 o'clock. They're set periods, approximately 20 personnel or people per group will come through on the evening of 30 October. So
And
get
is
your
there-
tickets. And,
I was going to ask, is there a telephone number to call about the tickets, information number?
575-5477.
Say that again.
575-5477. And that is
Excellent.
the Tillman House Museum.
And there is a charge for the tickets.
And it will be $10 per
$10
person.
per person.
All right. We're out of time. Thank you all for coming. I wish we could have gone on for an hour, but that's the thing about television. One is limited. I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.